Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge somebody in the audience who have grown up reading and who I respect a lot, Prashant Jha ji. Thank you so much for being here. And it's really a privilege that you're here and we're being able to engage with you. And of course, Ashok ji has already mentioned the people from Nepal who are here. What I will try to do in the course of the next 20 to 25 minutes, which I think I have, is cheat a bit and add one more term to the topic, which is the rationale as well. So rationale, conspiracy, fear and hope of federalism, and I think rationale and hope can perhaps get combined. It's very important to understand where the demand for federalism came from and why we are having this debate today. As we speak, Nepali streets are burning and there are multiple protests happening across the country, and we see a very rare kind of political assertion from below, and I think I actually think it's positive. But how did we get here? Ashok ji has already mentioned a bit of the historical context. The first thing to remember is that this has been a Kathmandu-centered state structure through its history. There has never been power delegated to the ground. It has always been a tiny ruling elite which has controlled the rest of the country through mostly coercion and sometimes through the facade of democracy. And this tiny ruling hill elite has come from very select Hindu upper caste communities of the hills. And the trigger for this demand for federalism has come from this aspiration from the ground to break the stranglehold of Kathmandu over the rest of the country. But it is, when one says this, the counterpoint that usually emerges is that, oh, you want power on the ground, why don't you have decentralization? And that's why I'd like to talk about the second rationale for federalism. People are not looking for administrative decentralization. People are looking for political power on the ground. People do not want, and marginalized communities in particular, do not want a local council which gets a budget from the center and those local councils are told you can spend it this way. That's not what federalism is. People are looking for and marginalized communities at the forefront of the federal agenda are looking for federal states where they can exercise political power, where they can raise taxes, where they can allocate taxes the way they want to, where they can decide how to use their resources, where they can decide their education policy, where they can decide their language policy, where they can decide what kind of cultural heritage they want to preserve and build upon. So this is not just about administrative decentralization but political power. And the third rationale that I'll add here is that this is about self-rule and dignity. And this I think is crucial because, as I said in the beginning, it's been a very tiny ruling hill elite. Most communities in Nepal have not been able to exercise any kind of political power and self-rule, and have always been at the receiving end of the states of the regime. And it's interesting that the debate in Nepal, especially from the end of the marginalized communities till the mid-90s, used to be one which was framed in terms of rights and justice. As long as the debate is framed in terms of rights and justice, you can be happy with constitutional guarantees and a degree of inclusion. But in the mid-90s, the Maoists did something which has changed the debate, which is that they said this is not just a problem of rights and justice, this is a problem of internal colonialism. As soon as you introduce the element of internal colonialism, the prescription changes. The prescription is no longer about constitutional guarantees. It is about self-rule and, if I may say so, almost independence. But I think it is a concession by marginalized communities to the hill regime and to the Kathmandu state that they are not talking about secession. And the Kathmandu elites don't recognize this enough. That I personally think that if certain groups raise the demand of secession, they can well be historically justified. They can have a historical ground, and some groups in the Tarai do it. I don't agree with that demand, but it's to the credit of the marginalized communities and the leaders of the marginalized communities that they have not sought to secede from Nepal, but they have sought to become Nepalis on different terms through federalism. And because they identify the problem as internal colonialism, and we can have a debate on this, but I do think they are right. If you look at Madhes or the Tarai, it was definitely a colonial enterprise by the Rana regime and the regime before that, and even the regime after that. You go and talk to Atharu, whose land was displaced, where hill settlers came in, they were enslaved, and they were treated as serfs. And I mean, the bonded labor custom was abolished as late as the late 90s. And these are people who I mean, it is a very clear case of colonialism, where there is somebody else from another community who has come and taken your land, who has treated you as a slave, who has given you no representation in the power structure. So these groups are not asking for secession. They are only asking for federalism now as a way to exercise self-rule and for the sake of dignity. So I think it's important to understand that this is the historic angst which is the trigger for federalism, and that's how the federalism debate emerged. The Maoists are blamed for inserting the poison of identity politics, as many Kathmandu commentators like to call it. But I think the Maoists definitely used it instrumentally. The Maoist leadership is a bound leadership. They realized that by mobilizing communities, marginalized communities, and by creating this narrative where marginalized communities were fighting a unitary Kathmandu state structure led by this Hill elite, they could mobilize support. But in the process, I think one positive outcome was that they could channel the energy and the aspirations of these groups within a united framework. I'd just like to throw this: what if they had not done it? You could not have held this back. This would have happened, and would it have been easier to handle it if there were 50 groups fighting about it, or is now I think politics has fragmented, and I'll talk about it in a bit. Or was it better that at least it was being politically channeled through an umbrella party? But when the time came to write the interim constitution in late 2006, early 2007, the Maoists did not insist on the inclusion of the term federalism in the interim constitution. That is what triggered the Madhes movement. There were people in the people in the Tarai who had supported the Maoist agenda for autonomy and federalism, felt that the Maoists had betrayed them as soon as they got into the power structure in Kathmandu. The interim constitution was burned the next day. It was the day after it was promulgated. That led to 21-day protests across Tarai, and that is what forced the Kathmandu state and the government of the day to incorporate federalism in the interim constitution. So and that's how it was decided. And so in the first sitting of the Constituent Assembly, that Nepal will become a federal democratic republic. So again, I mention this and I emphasize and I go into so much detail to show that this is not a gift that anybody is giving anybody. This is something that street movements have wrested from a very reluctant elite, and this struggle is continuing till today. And I'd like to talk a bit about this struggle because it's been a very difficult process, because at each step this demand for federalism there have been massive efforts to subvert it, and that's where I'd like to talk about the conspiracies, myths, and fears about federalism that have been propagated endlessly by Kathmandu elites. And these of course go together. The first is if you look at the non-inclusion of the term federalism in the interim constitution, I would say that was the first way in which they tried to subvert it. The second was when Madhes erupted. Instead of being responsive to the aspirations, the federal aspirations of the Madhesis, what the government of the day did was it shot people. So overall, 52 people have been killed in Madhes movements, two Madhes movements, but almost 30 people were killed by the Home Minister. And this is, mind you, a democratic government which came to power on the strength of a people's movement, and 8 months after it came to power on the strength of a people's movement was willing to shoot down popular protesters. The third is this constant effort through various conspiracies to seek to divide pro-federal forces. Tarai groups are fragmented primarily because of the personal ambition of political leaders, but there has been a lot of efforts. There have been lots of efforts by established old parties to divide any force which is federal. The fourth instance that I can think of, which is a clear conspiracy to me, is when there was a UML-led government, a Madhav Nepal-led government for 2 years between 2009 and 2010. They killed more than 200 activists who belong to armed groups. And this is no justification of violence, but it is a condemnation of extrajudicial executions. Almost 200 activists were killed in encounter killings. The Kathmandu elites have, of course, kept quiet about it. But by doing this too, I mean, it was basically to undermine pro-federal forces. Even, for the past 2 years, you've seen very strong forces in May 2010, when the term of the Constituent Assembly was getting expired, and in 2011, which have wanted to dissolve the CA. And I think the dissolution of the CA at one level was meant to weaken the Maoists, because the Maoists are the strongest force in the CA. But at another level, it was meant to weaken the federal agenda and to subvert the federal agenda completely. Because the CA, for all its flaws, is an institution that's owned by the marginalized communities. People feel they have a stake. This is the most, and this CA would one had hoped and one expected, and this is what the elites had feared and established political parties had feared, would deliver a federal constitution. And so the efforts to dissolve the CA, which unfortunately failed, but I can tell you they were very close to doing it, was also, I think, a very clear step in this conspiracy not to have federalism. As only a couple of months ago, top leaders were thinking about the prospect of postponing federalism. I know a meeting, and this comes from people who have attended that meeting, where the three political parties, the Nepali Congress, Maoist and UML, top two leaders of these parties and two leaders of the Madhesi Front were participating in it. And a UML leader, and I'll not name him here, said that, look, we will not agree to your model of federalism. You will not agree to our model of federalism. The Madhesis will not agree to whatever the three of us propose. So let's postpone federalism for now. And even the Maoist leadership was willing to flirt with the idea. The only reason this got sabotaged was because of the immediate public backlash. There were writings on op-ed pages, but more importantly, there was an immediate consolidation of the Madhesi Front and an emerging alliance of the Madhesis, Janjatis, and other marginalized communities, who threatened the big parties and the big leaders, all of whom happened to be Bawans, by the way, that this will not be acceptable. And that is when they stepped back, and the Maoists realized that if they give up the issue of identity-based federalism, their political support would get eroded. So even last week, last week there was a proposal by the Nepali Congress Parliamentary Party leader Ramchandra Poudel and a UML leader who is considered a great Democrat by some people, KP Oli, to file a no-confidence motion against this government. That, again, I think, is a conspiracy to subvert federalism. Because if this government, the Baburam Bhattarai-led government, which for its flaws has taken the peace process forward and has been able to create a mood of political consensus, had got overthrown last week, we could have bid the prospects of a constitution and a federal constitution goodbye. Fortunately, again, that did not work. The Maoists, Madhesis remained together, and the Nepali Congress was brought into the government as a part of this national unity agreement. The UML has not joined it. But I'm just going through this litany of instances because I want to convey that that this has been a very difficult process, and the federal agenda has remained on the national agenda because of a very concerted push by marginalized communities, not because of, as I said earlier, the blessings of established parties which would have subverted it a long time ago. On one hand, you have these political conspiracies which have been going on, but the other battle has been the battle for the narrative. And on this front too, it's been a very arduous battle, I think. The first tool that has been used, and Ashok mentioned it, is this thing of national unity, and how national unity would be jeopardized if there is federalism. No argument can be more pathetic than this, because no force has asked for secession. The simple fact is that no force has asked for secession, and marginalized communities and parties and parties which are asking for federalism want to be a part of the Nepali state. It's these people, the Madhesi groups, for example, who say, make us a part of the Nepal army. There are less than 6% Madhesis in a 93,000 strong Nepal army. If you include the Tharus, the number goes up to 6,000 out of 95,000. But it's Madhesi Hindu castes are less than that. And even if it's 6,000 out of 95,000, it's 8% or so. It is these groups who are saying we want a federal system. Nobody wants to secede from the Nepali state. This disintegration, the fear of disintegration has been deliberately stoked in order to undermine the federal agenda. The second card that has been played on this for this battle of the narrative is again what's something that Ashok mentioned, which is that these would be ethnic provinces. I will talk about, I have the maps, the 5-6 maps which are being discussed, and I'll just come to it in a moment. But I'd just like to counter this by saying that no province in Nepal can be ethnic or solely ethnic. It's a mixed country. There is enormous diversity. There is enormous migration. Whichever way you carve out provinces, the provinces will be multi-ethnic. The question is, and the battle is, can you carve out provinces in a way which gives demographic advantage to marginalized communities? Those who argue for or who raise this bogey of ethnic federalism either don't want federalism or want federalism in a way that is conducive to the hegemony of Hilapa castes. And those who want federalism based on identity want to carve out provinces in a way which gives them a demographic advantage, so that the centuries of being excluded from the power structure can be countered. And I'll discuss this in some detail and even go to the levels how changing a few districts here and there changes the demography of the province, especially in a small country like Nepal. The third card that has been played and is that provinces is to project provinces as almost independent units which will have nothing to do with each other and thus will not be able to take advantage of each other. So it is said that let's have north-south provinces, because then hills and Tarai can take advantage of each other. Otherwise, why would Tarai want to be completely isolated from the hills? Now this again is a myth, and because in any federal system there is interprovincial cooperation. Of course, there are interprovincial tensions. It's not easy. The Indian example shows us that that there is, say, river sharing tension between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. There has been tension between Punjab and Haryana on river sharing. There will be, so that is inevitable in a federal system. But does it mean that there are no mechanisms for to take advantage of each other's complementarities? No. There will be, nobody, the new constitution of Nepal will give freedom of movement, will give freedom to citizens to reside anywhere, and will give freedom to citizens to set up enterprises anywhere. A hill person will use the Tarai border to go to India. A Tarai person will come to Kathmandu for opportunities. When an industry is set up in the Tarai, they will look for raw materials from the hills. When something is set up in the hills, they will look for human resources or labor from across the country. There will be interprovincial complementarities, and this myth that one province will have nothing to do with each other, and that's why we need to carve it out in a way which, again, as I said, would be conducive to hill caste hegemony, is a myth, and it's actually it's based on mischief. The fourth is this myth of, as again, this is something that you mentioned, which is this myth of economic viability. Economic viability is a consideration. Let's not have provinces which don't have a single municipality, a single university, a single hospital, a single high school. I think for provinces for those kinds of provinces to sustain would be very difficult. Which is why, say, the 14-state model proposed a province in the northern western reaches. That province I don't think is feasible, and the more recent proposals have dropped it. But viability is a second consideration. The rationale for federalism, as I earlier tried to argue, is primarily to give historically marginalized communities a degree of self-rule and dignity, and they will make it viable. I again think of India here. When Jharkhand was split from Bihar, everybody said Bihar would collapse because all the mineral resources have gone. Bihar has actually improved in the last 12 years since Jharkhand left. So it's not about the resources. It's also about governance, the rule, and the administration, and many other factors. And I think, given that the rationale for federalism in the Nepali context is to give different communities self-rule, they will figure out a way to be viable. Kathmandu elites don't need to worry about it. Their worry about viability for different parts of Nepal has been seen, and where we are right now, and given the poverty and inequality we spoke about, I don't think marginalized communities have any faith in the older parties to think of, or believe that these older parties are thinking about prosperity for them when they talk about viability. There is one genuine fear I would like to seriously talk about here, which is the fear of the Dalits. The Dalits have been, interestingly, they have been slightly uncomfortable with the federal project, and they have felt that because they are not concentrated in any particular area, they will not get a province, and that their discrimination and exploitation will continue. I think this is a genuine fear. And I think that the other marginalized communities, Madhesis and Janjatis, both have not done enough to reach out to the Dalits and to allay this apprehension. I personally think that while the Dalits are right that they will not have a province, there is a slight misreading of what federalism does. If you look at, say, the Eastern Tarai, which will probably be a province, the Dalit population will constitute a very significant demographic bloc. In the electoral politics of that province, the Dalit vote bank will be crucial for any party to come to power, and that demographic compulsion will force political parties to be sensitive to Dalit concerns. At some point, when Dalit leadership emerges, what happened in UP, for example. Dalits will ally in the beginning perhaps with a party which is more amenable to their concerns, but in 5 years, in 10 years, a Dalit leadership will emerge, and that Dalit leadership has a better chance of getting to power if you have a federal system than it has a chance of getting to power in Kathmandu. Between 1990 and 2002, all the parliaments in Nepal had one Dalit out of 205 representatives. The hallowed 1990s, which was so wonderful and which we should have continued with, had one Dalit out of 205. Now, at least in the Constituent Assembly, you have 50 Dalits, primarily due to the efforts of the Maoists and the proportional representation system. It's more difficult for Dalits to gain power in a centralized power structure than in the provincial. This is an argument, I think, that needs to be made to Dalit communities, and they have to be reassured of a share in the power structure in future provinces. That argument has not been made, and that is why one sees that Dalit communities are across the country, but particularly Hill Dalit communities, not as much the Tarai Dalit communities, are more apprehensive about federalism, and they have even some of them have even allied with other dominant communities to resist federalism. Let me jump from these conspiracies and myths and this very gloomy kind of politics that one has to battle with to the debates which are happening right now, and I think that's more exciting. For the first time, because the peace process moved ahead, the door for constitution making opened up, and we finally have debates on federal models and on constitutional issues, and these are very vibrant debates happening not only in op-ed pages of papers, but in political circles and across tea shops in districts across the country, and I think that's positive. And this is a debate that should have perhaps begun. We should have started in full earnest 4 years ago. I think people were talking about it, but it is now that it has gained the vibrancy. Let me here look at some of the models which have been presented. The first model to have emerged was the one by the subject committee of the Constituent Assembly, which came out with this proposal last year, and this is a 14-state proposal. I'll just pass it around so that you can have a look. Since it's a small group, and this 14-state proposal was pushed by the Maoists, and because there was. Before I talk about this, let me just talk about how the Maoists are still relatively more committed to the federal project and to identity-based federalism because their support base comes from these communities. Their leadership is bound, and that's why there is doubt and suspicion among marginalized communities about whether this commitment will hold. But as of now, one sees that this commitment will. The second communist party, which is communist only in name, UML, has a sizable base of indigenous communities, and in the past few months we have seen the Janjati MPs of the UML party consolidating. In fact, the leader of the Janjati caucus is from the UML party, and the UML is completely bound Brahmanical in its orientation, and in my opinion is one of the most conservative parties in Nepal, more conservative than the Nepali Congress. But the Janjati pressure within UML has meant that the UML cannot go completely with against federalism or for this kind of federalism which suits only the Hill upper castes. Then you have the Madhesi parties, who are completely, of course, for federalism. Their initial demand was one province across the Tarai. That demand was opposed by some communities living in the Tarai, the Tharus, for example, who felt that this would only mean hegemony of Madhesi upper caste, as well as the Kathmandu establishment, which felt that this would give Madhes enormous leverage over Kathmandu because that province would have controlled the border. So these are, and the Congress has been as Krishna Chetu, a member of the State Restructuring Commission, always puts it, the Nepali Congress has been reluctant federalists. They have not wanted it. They have been dragged to this agenda, like they've had to be dragged to each progressive agenda. Republic was something that they had to be dragged towards. 12-point agreement was something they had to be dragged towards. So this is the broad interplay of political forces, and in the CA. In the CA, the Maoists have 240 seats. Which is not a majority. 301 is a majority. The UML has about 110, and the Madhesis have 83, and the Congress has 120. Why I mention these figures is because to draft the constitution, to promulgate the constitution, you need a 2/3 majority, not just a simple majority. So you need 401 members to back a certain federal model for it to pass through. So the first proposal, as I was saying, was brought out by the State Restructuring Commission, and this 14-state proposal is something that Janjatis are more comfortable with than any other community. This happened because Maoists and two Janjati members of the UML defected from the party line and voted for this proposal. But this proposal has been criticized on a few grounds. The first is that this is not viable. 14 states is a bit too much for a country of Nepal's population. The second criticism is that it gives only priority to identity and no priority to, and does not take into account viability at all. And which is particularly said in the context of the Jadant state, which is here, which is the state which is considered fairly unviable, and to some extent the Sherpa state, which would be quite small. The Madhesis are happy about. I mean, in private negotiations, the Madhesis have given up this one state demand and can settle for two states. But they are happy about the fact that this original state restructuring committee report gives them two states. What they are unhappy about is that these two states are not contiguous. They would like Chitwan, which is here, to be a bridge between the two states, because there is a provision that two states, if contiguous, can merge at a certain point. I personally think that the trend of state formation and federalism in South Asia is towards fragmentation, not merger. So I don't see states really merging, but that's the objection of the Madhesi parties. But this proposal is pretty much off the table. I mean, it is a basis, and Janjatis and Maoists do talk about it, but nobody is seriously talking about a 14-state model now. Then the State Restructuring Commission was formed. This is a constitutionally mandated commission, and this commission should have been formed 3 years ago, and they would have had time to really discuss and debate through the issues through. But they had 3 months, and in 3 months they did as good a job as they could. But they came up with two proposals. The divide in the SRC is very interesting. The Maoists, the Madhesis, the Maoist members of Janjatis, two Janjati members of the nominated by the Maoist party, two members nominated by the Madhesi parties. One happened to be a Madhesi, one happened to be a Janjati, and one member, the Dalit chair of the commission. The Dalit chair of the commission, they came up with a majority proposal. The Dalit, in this case, went with the Janjatis and the Madhesis, and the Madhesi member from UML supported this proposal. So the majority proposal is on party lines a Maoist Madhesi proposal, but in terms of social forces, and I think in the federalism debate, party lines don't matter as much as the social forces and ethnic forces do. It's the Madhesi Janjati Dalit proposal in the State Restructuring Commission. And the other proposal is a 6th province proposal by Bawans and Chetris, by the Nepali Congress and UML, and one member of UML, including the PhD of New York that perhaps Ashok was referring to, but I'll leave it at that. The SRC model, the majority model, is of 11 states. One state is a non-territorial Dalit province, and I think this is why the Dalits came on board. Which would, I don't know how exactly it would work, but I think what the committee says in its report is that there would be a council at the central level with certain powers, which would be for Dalits. But I think on the 10 territorial states that the SRC majority proposal talks about, it has two provinces in the Tarai, contiguous, Eastern Tarai, Western Tarai, and it has the other 8 are in the hills, and they are named after the dominant ethnic community. So the Eastern Hills would be Limbuan. The right adjacent to that is the Kirat province. Then you have Tamsaling, which is the area around Kathmandu, which is dominated by Tamans. Kathmandu itself would be named after the dominant indigenous community there, Nevars, who are no longer the dominant, I think, because of migration, but it would be named after them. And then you would have two provinces in the west. One is Tamuan, which would be the Gurung province, and Magarat. There would be one province called Narayani in the middle, which would include parts of Chitwan. And Chitwan is divided in this, and this is another debate. Do you divide up districts or not? Nepal right now has 75 districts. The Maoists are willing to divide up districts, so are the Madhesis. The Madhesis want districts divided actually, but the Nepali Congress does not want the 75 districts divided. And then you have Karnali province in the far west, which is only hills. Now this is again a proposal that in the beginning everybody opposed, but again the Maoists, Janjatis and the Madhesis are relatively more comfortable with this proposal than any other proposal. That brings us if these are the proposals that the Janjatis and Madhesis and Maoists are comfortable with, there are the 6 province model of the SRC Commission and the 7 province of the Nepali Congress. Now the difference, you will see the difference here. What does the Nepali Congress do? The Nepali Congress takes away 3 districts here. So they give the entire Tarai Plains, the SRC. The Nepali Congress takes away 3 districts here to the hills. I'll tell you what this does, and this is why Janjatis and Madhesis both oppose it, and this is the devious ploy of the hill elites to talk about multi-ethnic federal provinces. In this province, you will have 12% Limbus, 18% Rais, and 42% Bawan Kshetris. So this is a ploy to ensure the demographic dominance of Bawan Kshetris. This province will give a slight demographic advantage to the Limbus of the region. Now, when the ethnic groups had initially demanded preferential political rights, which would mean that only a Limbu can become a Limbu chief minister. Now what we see that the ethnic groups are willing, and I personally am against that, because I think that violates notions of individual citizenship, and you have to treat all individuals in the provinces equally. The ethnic groups seem to have given up that demand, or at least they have not pushed for it as vociferously in recent debates. If the ethnic groups have given up that demand, and all citizens in that province will be treated equally, then for the rationale of federalism that I earlier talked about, which is to address historic marginalization, they deserve a demographic advantage. In such a province, there are Bawans and Kshetris, the Limbuan province. But there are, we know that the Bawans are also a part of Limbu groups now. There is no ethnic group, there is no marginalized group, the Maoist Party does not say that these minorities will be treated as second-class citizens. In fact, to address their fears, minority rights should be guaranteed within these provinces. But what I think the model of federalism that we should look at is something that gives demographic advantage to the marginalized communities. Now this province, this SRC model, except Kathmandu, where Newars are 1 or 2% less than Bawans Kshetris, and Tamua, the Gurung province, where again Bawans and Kshetris are in a majority compared to the Gurungs, because Leknath municipality is incorporated here, and it had to be incorporated because it is the only municipality in that province. The other hill provinces, at least on this side, have a demographic advantage for Janjatis. And that's why the Janjatis talk about having more provinces, because it gives them that. As soon as you carve it out as a 7-province model or a 6-province model that the SRC minority report has done, you end up giving demographic advantage to Bawans Kshetris. And I think this is why the numbers is an important debate. I'm sorry if I'm getting into too much detail, but I do think I do want to give a sense of the kind of debates and the kind of detailed debates that have now begun in Nepal. So once this happened, the UML is a party that has not been able to. It's called a party that it's seen as a party that flip-flops a lot. But the structural reason for that is that UML has not been able to reconcile between the slight radical edge that its base still has and the completely conservative orientation of its leadership. And that's why you see different proposals coming from UML all the time. So UML earlier came up with the same proposal as NC, but now they have come up, because of Janjati pressure, with this 12-province proposal. Now what this 12-province proposal does is it incorporates many Janjati concerns in hill provinces. But Madhesis are not happy with it, because it divides up Tarai into 5 provinces. Madhesis are willing to live with 2 provinces, but dividing up Tarai into 5 provinces is a bit too much for them to accept. And all of this then finally has resulted in a 10-province compromise model of the Maoists. Discussions right now are centering around this. Irrespective of what the Congress says about 7, substantive discussions among the parties, from what one gathers, is happening around this model. Now, what you see in this is, if you look at the far west, this area is dominated by Tharus. But in the 2 extreme far west districts, Kanchanpur and Kailali, there is a Tharu population as well as a sizable Pahadi population. In Kanchanpur, the hill population constitutes the majority. Now there has been a 15-day bandh in this region, where the hill community, basically Bawans and Kshetris, Brahmins and Kshetris, supported by all the 3 national political parties, Nepali Congress, UML and the Maoists, have demanded a unified far west. So they would like these 2 districts here to be a part of the hill province and to be unified. The Tharus of the region are resisting it, and this has even led to a degree of violence. Even yesterday in Kathmandu, in Dhangadi, there were clashes and 30 people got injured, including a Tharu leader, Lakshman, has got injured. What one sees is the trend is that the leaders of this unified far west agitation are Pahadi Bawans and Kshetris. And the administration is also led by Bawans and Kshetris. So their protests are dealt with leniently, but Tharu protests are dealt with fairly ruthlessly. And this communal disconnect between the state and protesters, we could see in Madhes earlier, and we can see, and this is what will inflame communal tension. Because Tharus are trying to resist it. I mean, Kathmandu has a tendency of blaming will blame the underdog, the Kathmandu media. But the communal tensions will get inflamed because of the discriminatory attitude of the state and their tendency to go with the dominant communities, right? Madhesis and Tharus don't want Kanchanpur Kailali to go with the far west. My sense is that if you look at the kind of agitation that has happened, the hill settlers don't want to live with a Tharuwat province. So they will have to compromise where certain parts of these two districts will have to be given to the far west. It cannot be a unified far west because Kailali has a 30% or something Tharu population. So if the hill settlers are not willing to, and a bit of self-awareness on the part of Pahadis in this region is important because they came, bought the land, enslaved and gifted the land during autocratic regimes and enslaved the Tharus, and now they claim that that territory is theirs. Even if there is a compromise, some parts will also have to be given to the Tharu region, and the solution perhaps lies in dividing the districts instead of treating it as sacrosanct categories. Now you look at the Far East. In the Far East, these three districts, and this is an important region because lots of Nepali Congress, UML politicians come from Morang Sunsari Jhapa. Jhapa movement happened in the 70s, right after Naxalbari. It's right next to Naxalbari, and many present generation UML leaders come from there. The Koirala family's political home was Biratnagar, and you can see that these leaders don't want to give up this region to Madhes because the demography is such that there will be a Madhesi chief minister, and they don't frankly want to live under a Madhesi ruled state. I mean, little recognizing that Madhesis and Tharus and Janjatis have lived under their rule forever, but when it comes to living under a Madhesi chief minister, they have these problems now. So the Congress wants to put this in a hill province because it gives them a demographic advantage. The latest proposal that is emerging is that the Maoists Maoists are suggesting let's carve this into three separate a separate province consisting of these three districts. It also has a Rajbanshi population, so it can be called Kochilla. And but this is something that the Madhesis will resist, and they will also resist because this has the Morang Sunsari industrial belt, which is an important industrial belt. This has Biratnagar, and Biratnagar is of course a major urban center as well as a border outpost. And two fairly influential Madhesi leaders their constituencies are in Sunsari. So because NC and UML leader, and this is what has happened, we are designing long-term institutions and structures, but the personal ambitions of leaders who are and their personal calculations are playing a very big part in determining the boundaries. So NC and UML leaders want it separate, Madhesi leaders would like it here because many of them come from the region. I have got into this much detail because, as I said, I wanted to give you a sense of the debates that are happening right now, what the considerations and calculations are on the part of both the dominant parties, dominant communities, as well as communities which are aspiring for a degree of self-rule through identity-based federalism. As you may have noticed by now, I have a clear bias in favor of identity-based federalism. I don't do anything to hide it, and I do think that it's important to Nepal is a very diverse country. There have to be, when identity-based federalism comes into play, reassurances must be given to minority communities in those provinces. I personally, apart from constitutional guarantees, I also have a sense that electoral politics will play a big part in balancing things. This Tarai province, for example, you will have at least 6 demographic blocks who will play an influential role here. You will have the Yadavs, you will have the Tharus, you will have the Dalits, you will have the Muslims, you will have the OBCs, you will have the Madhesi upper castes, and you will have the Pahadi settlers. The Pahadi settlers who live around the highway. There will be 7 demographic blocks. Any Madhesi party which says we need to throw the Pahadis out will lose the election, because the swing vote here will be of the Pahadis. And if they do that, there will be 5 other parties who will ensure that, who will take a pro-Pahadi agenda because they will not want to lose that constituency. You can see this already happening in Madhesi party. Sharad Singh Bhandari, for example, is Pahadi leader from the region, is become a very radical Madhesi because he wants to earn legitimacy with the Madhesis, and then he sees his future in the community, and this electoral dynamic will play a balancing role. And that's why the fear-mongering about ethnic federalism is wrong. In Limbuan, you will have Bauns and Kshetris who will have their leaders, and Limbus will have to negotiate with those Baun Kshetri leaders, and if anybody wants to throw them out, that Limbu party will have difficulty in winning the election. So that Nepal's geography and Nepal's ethnic mosaic is such that there will be a balancing role, and this we often forget. Example, after the Gujarat riots, I mean, there was such a concerted attack on BJP by even Hindu liberals. You don't see that in Nepal. You don't see Pahadi Bawan Kshetri supporting Madhesis and Janjatis. You see a clear disconnect. You will not find a Bawan Kshetri either supporting federalism wholeheartedly or supporting identity-based federalism, and you will not see a Madhesi or Janjati either opposing federalism or opposing identity-based federalism. That ethnic polarization has deepened, also because of extremism on the part of these communities, but also because of the reluctance of the established leadership to share any power and to empathize with the aspirations of these communities. That's the big picture. I'll just end by saying that I hope I'm not sounding too pessimistic, because I actually am optimistic about this moment. I think that Nepal has undergone 5 multiple transitions in a very compressed period of time, from monarchy to republic, from war to peace, from unitary to federal, from Hindu kingdom to secular state, and from a very monolithic exclusivist kind of nationalism to an inclusive notion of citizenship. And this is happening within 6 years or 7 years, and this is what countries take decades to institutionalize. So we are approaching the end game of this. The constitution has to be written in 12 days. I have doubts whether it will get written in 12 days, but I think it is an exciting moment. It is a moment where all communities are asserting themselves, and I think that is both natural and the democratic thing to do. One just hopes that it does not turn violent, and that the established elites have the good sense to share power, because if they don't, history will not forgive them. There will be resistance this time. The people will not succumb and accept the kind of hegemony that they want to impose, continue to impose. Thank you so much.
Prashant, the comment you made about the liberalism of the dominant Hindu group in India, you know, it's not the Hindu part of it, it's the Gandhian part of it. You know, and I wanted to ask you, therefore, is there anyone, for example, in Nepal today, who is actually trying to draw inspiration from the Gandhian tradition, or is it too old, too late? The second thing I want to ask you is, you know, as our federalism in India is also ethnicity-based, identity-based, and it's been the one great unqualified success in India so far. Now, of course, there's a big difference of size, but a crucially important thing that most people don't think about is the role that the electoral system adopted by us played. Now, we kind of bumbled into it by just following the British, but the fact is that the simple majority voting system in India forced communities to come together, because you had to get a minimum number of votes to get power. Afterwards, of course, it also unfortunately worked against representative politics, because once you get power, power creates new elites, and you co-opt elements of these groups who come together, and you forget economically it creates classification. I was just wondering what the thinking is in Nepal on this issue, and one thing that struck me is, but it might be a solution, I mean, it may be too late to think about it, propose it now, but the fact is it possible to conceive of proportional representation within the ethnic units or the identity units, and simple majority vote for the national election?
Talking about marginalized community and all those things, and they are struggling. But what if the ruling class deliberately fails or deliberately ignores to deliver federalism? Is there any penalty system that the marginalized community is thinking about imposing? For example, in India, they threw Britishers out of India. Some sort of penalty system. Is there any? Do you see any penalty system is going to be there?
Thank you. Sanjay?
That was terrific presentation. It's really articulate and comprehensive. I had two questions. One was, can you say a little bit more about why what I would describe as a sort of classic nation-state model as a political imaginary is so powerful in Kathmandu? The subset to that would be, to what extent have foreign actors, various kinds, serve to reinforce that? The reason I ask is because I've met several people, some actually former classmates who've come as consultants to Nepal, and they're worried about federalism, ethnic federalism. And often in these particular cases, they're from Europe themselves. The Yugoslavia is what is in their mind, Nigeria, right? So there are lots of ethno-federal systems. Some have failed, some have succeeded. But that complicated history is not often part of the debate. They focus on failure, not on success. So could you say a little bit more about the imaginary itself? What's fueling it? Or is this sort of does this have its own indigenous roots? And if so, and what role then do foreign actors of various kinds have? The second is, can you say a little bit more then about, I mean, there is a real concern. I'm completely sympathetic to your view of having federalism based on various types of identities. Now, the question then becomes, what rules, institutions, and procedures can you create so that it could be fiscal, it could be electoral, it could be political, that actually facilitates power sharing across groups, across regions? I mean, you mentioned a couple, like there might be electoral, demographic reasons why you have to reach out, but that raises the issue. So, could you be a little bit more specific? Is it proportional representation, for instance, or is it certain provisions in the constitutional regime? India would be one example, but there could be others. But could you just say a little bit more about that? Because there are some real concerns about, even with the intentions being good, if you create certain institutional structures, incentives will be such that there will be centrifugal tendencies. So how do you make them centripetal? What types of institutions do you foresee that would allow sufficient self-rule at the same time as actually creating incentives and pressures that bring things together? I mean, the same fear actually, now many years ago in Afghanistan, there's a fear of federalism. And there are good and bad reasons for it in a place like Afghanistan, which is, I think, more complicated than Nepal. But could you say a little bit more about some of the institutional aspects that you think would actually facilitate the kind of federalism you think is necessary?
Thank you. Why don't we...
I think it's sorely lacking. I don't think it's a very... if you look back at recent Nepali history, it was the Nepali Congress leadership which was inspired by the Gandhian tradition to some extent. But they were not as rigid as Gandhi, for example, in following it. So even B.P. Koirala did have these phases where he pushed violent rebellion in 1950, even in the 1970s against the autocracy. But there was a stream of thought within the NC leadership which followed both the principles of non-violence and tolerance and inclusion and this, I think, this empathy. But I don't see that having continued, or that having, especially in the NC, and I think that's the real tragedy, because this is a party which had these strong democratic roots, and it has become a club of notables, and does not carry that tradition anymore. In terms of non-violence, yes, but otherwise no. The Maoists of course, I mean, I do not believe the Maoists are Gandhians with guns, as some of your intellectuals do. But I think it's so difficult to understand what the Maoists believe in and what is only tactical for them in terms of this reaching out to the groups that they have done. I mean, it is at one level instrumental, but because they make the right noises, people see them as reaching out more than others. But of course, that's not the Gandhian tradition. I think it's just this political use of this. So to answer in a nutshell, I think that tradition is lacking. A very interesting question about the electoral system, and this, I think, ties in with what you were also talking about. The electoral system that's been presently that was used for the Constituent Assembly election was a mixed system, where about 60% of the seats, or 55% of the seats it was a mixed system where both first past the post and proportional representation was used. Proportional representation was based on the percentage of votes polled by the parties, but there was a quota system within PR, and the parties had to give a certain degree of representation on their lists to Madhesis, Janjatis, Dalits, women, and people from backward regions, and that actually led to inclusion. What is being discussed right now is a two-chamber house at the central level, where these numbers have just come up and they've not been finalized, where there would be about 385 members in the lower house, and out of which 385 in the total legislature at the center. Out of that, about 60, it's 55-45, where 55% of the seats in the lower house would be through first past the post and 45% through PR. So in a house of 325. Now the criticism is that this is too big for a country of 29 million. The marginalized communities have pushed for this. The Janjatis and women and Dalits especially, because they think that it is through PR that they will get represented. The Madhesis, interestingly, have a different position on this. They say that, as you said, that all seats should be directly elected at the central level, in the lower house. But what they would like to see is a strong upper house. The present way it's being conceived is only 60 members in the upper house, and upper house is important for federalism, and this is being seen as again a way to weaken federalism. The electoral system at the provincial level has not been discussed, to my knowledge, as much, because I think it's waiting for provinces to have a firmer idea about the kind of provinces. But probably they'll go for a mixed system there as well, with the advantage with the mixed system is that it enables inclusion. The disadvantage, I think, is that it creates this two-class citizenry within the legislature, where the PR guys are always looked down upon by the first past the post, and it also has this accountability problem. A person who's been elected directly by a constituency, of course, has more accountability. So that's where the electoral system is. On penalty, I don't think you can have a constitutional penalty. There will be a political price to pay. I don't see anybody now saying there can be no federalism. Everybody is on board with the fact that there will have to be federalism. The debate now is the kind of federalism, and if parties go back on federalism or try to create a federal structure that is meaningless or give states no power, then there will be a political price in terms of radicalization of politics of these marginalized communities. If right now the people who are speaking are the moderates, who are saying give us a state. If you don't give that, then what's going to happen is that the armed groups will emerge. The armed groups are already active in Tarai and they're not dead. And they will then say that, look, we always told you that peaceful constitutional politics will not get you anything. And we have examples from the regions showing this. So do all of us as Nepalis want to pay that political price? It's not just the dominant communities of the state. Everybody will pay that price. So I think there is a realization that that there will be a political price of going back or backtracking on the federal project completely. This also I think ties in with your question about this fear of federalism. There is a fear, and as I mentioned, there are several things that have been pushed but I was just in Myanmar recently to cover the by-elections for the Hindu, and the kind of fear of federalism that you see in a place like Yangon, that's not there in Kathmandu anymore. There is that apprehension, there is this concerted push not to have it, but the intensity of the scale of Burman hegemony and the way self-rule cannot be envisaged at all, and I know it's a democracy problem as well, or the thing that happened in Sri Lanka. At least we are better off than that. I mean, the Sinhalese majority was not willing to consider the terms federalism. Here, that's not happened, and I don't think it's because of the desire of the elites to share power. It's because of their weakness, and it's because of the strength of the marginalized communities and their movements. But fortunately, I think we have passed that. But I think the reason why the old classic monolithic kind of nation-state imagination holds sway in Nepal is not due to external factors as much as internal factors, and this goes to the indoctrination during the royal period. King Mahendra, when he took over in 1960, had to deal with the democratic opposition, and the way he built his regime was by pushing this monolithic, homogenizing kind of nationalism, which was based on one language, one dress, one religion, faith in monarchy, and that is what, I mean, that's a very recent memory, and it's a very bitter memory for marginalized communities. That I think that, and it was through textbooks, panchayat textbooks, for example, pushed this agenda, and present day leaders of political parties are a product of that education system, are a product of that schooling of that royal political schooling. And I think that imagination of the nation as this homogeneous unit where everybody has to be assimilated on terms set by the dominant and not respected and integrated on and in terms of the diversity. And that, I think, I trace it more to the 1960s and 70s. Of course, it has a long history, but this contemporary battle to that, then to external. On foreign actors, foreign actors have. There is criticism of international groups, bilaterals as well as multilateral donors, for promoting the Janjati agenda and Madhesi agenda. Madhesis definitely, they did nothing to promote our agenda. 2006, the 7, when the Madhes movement happened, many donors had to be told what Madhes was. In 2005, I'll give you an instance. World Bank came out with its big exclusion report in Nepal, and they forgot to mention the term Madhesis, and then they had to update it in 2008. But with the Janjatis, they have funded a Janjati organization in the 90s. But I personally think that the donors woke up to the exclusion agenda very late. And I don't see it as many Kathmandu people do as completely stoked by donors, and to undermine the state. There are many who believe that this is a donor agenda. Because I tend to emphasize more on the domestic roots, I feel that this was about to happen. Other foreign actors, and there are other donors who are not comfortable with it, who would have preferred it to remain unitary, or who would prefer it to be river system based, as one donor head always refers to it. But there are others, other foreign. I mean, the others are peripheral. The key foreign actor in Nepal is India, and India has, to my understanding, not pushed on this constitutional issue. They have, and they do get involved in almost all major events in Nepal, political transformations, but they have kept a studied silence on federalism, because I think they know that whatever they do will antagonize one side, and they don't want to burn their bridges. They have a very close relationship with Madhesis, like they have with other political parties, and for Madhesis, federalism is the bottom line. So so I think, when there are people who have been in the past few weeks commenting that India is pushing a Madhya Pradesh. India is not pushing a Madhya Pradesh. What people who say that, what they want India to do is lean on the Madhesis to give up the Madhya Pradesh. That India is not doing either. India is not putting pressure on the Madhesis, give up your agenda. But India is not going all out in Kathmandu supporting the Madhesi agenda, because that will actually undermine the credibility of the Madhesi agenda, as well as not be as effective, I think. So they have very interestingly remained silent on federalism till now.
For obvious reason. This fear of ethnic identity-based federalism disintegrating Nepal is, I think, very little to do with fear, but it's a lot to do with fear-mongering. Okay. So I think just to have the fear that Nepal will disintegrate has to assume that Nepal was integrated. Nepal was never integrated. Nepal was put together by brute military force and very cunning administrative acrobatics. That has been the history. Now, going back as an anthropologist myself, let me tell you that the hills of Nepal, the mountains of Nepal have been probably inhabited for 5,000 years, if not more. So 97% of Nepal's political history, people lived in small political units, either based on linguistics, boundaries and all cultural boundaries and so on. When the Hindus became refugees in India after the Muslim invasion and they had to take, asylum in Nepal, Nepal was very, run by small political systems and units. Actually, until Darbezao or even Prithviraj Shah, Nepal was like that. Okay. So when Prithviraj Shah came, he put together this country. But was it really an integration? No, it was not an integration. So to assume that Nepal will disintegrate is a very, I would just say, not Kathmandu-centric, because there are in Kathmandu people like the Newars who have a very different book, but Kathmandu elite-centric view. Okay? And just also I want to I appreciate very much what you said is that if you look at the history of Nepal, no group has asked to secede. Look, the Limbuwan for 240 years, 45 years since Prithviraj Shah has been a federal state based on ethnic identity. It was one autonomous Limbuwan state based on Kirat and on Kipat system. Did it ever ask? Yes, there were some groups, radical groups that asked in the last maybe 50 years or so, but majority have not asked. So as you say, this is all about fear mongering. Okay, you should not do this because Nepal will disintegrate. So to me, I think this is just simply a counter argument. When the issue comes, you say, well, it will disintegrate.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. And then
and alumnus of the news school, we edit an online monthly called East-West Inquiry. This kind of topics I discuss. Anyway, mine is a four-part question. They all come from a very layman's point of view. The first one is Maoists. Is any particular ethnic group that dominates Maoists, or is it across the cross-section of all ethnic? The second part is, you did say about the danger of secession, and you also said there is no danger of seceding any part. That was the case with Pakistan also before Bangladesh seceded. Of course, it's an entirely different situation because Nepal is not the geographical aberration that Pakistan was before Bangladesh broke off, because divided by 1,000 miles of foreign territory, which they perceive to be hostile. So that experience is not there. That situation is still. If some groups are systematically, consistently denied, deprived of political power, there is a danger of momentum building. My question is there any particular region where they can come together and they will demand, the same way Bangladesh is demanded? In 1970, they won the election. They were in majority, but they were not allowed to form the government, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back in the case of Pakistan. Is there any scenario like that emerging from all these conflicts? And the third part of the question is there one unifying force in all of Nepal, unifying all these groups and all these interests in one aspect? The last part of the question, partly you answered that, foreign actors. I'm particularly concerned about India and China. Many Nepalis complain both countries are meddling. Is there any complaint like that from your experience? They complaining that India and China are meddling in internal affairs of Nepal.
Thank you. Chris?
Great talk. I really enjoyed this. I have two questions. One is, I'm wondering if identity-based federalism is just the wrong word. I was sort of one of these foreigners who feared the identity-based federalism when I was hearing it. I lived in Ithaca for a long time, and so there was a lot of things at Cornell and a lot of these talks, and I was always worried when I was hearing about this because I would immediately jump to the Yugoslavia example and worry about this. But what you described when you said that the ethnic, for lack of a better word, had given up a notion of preferential rights within these political units. For me, that's really a crucial term, because it does get into this issue. They have to do electoral politics, right? That yes, there's demographic advantage. That's not the same as identity. And because for me, the problem I have all along with identity-based federalism is identity is not a fixed quantity. Identity is something that's constructed and sustained over time, and shifts and generational shifts and so on. And so the notion that you would ossify within the structure of the state some sort of bounded identity is extraordinarily problematic. But demographic advantage is very different. We actually have something similar in the United States vis-a-vis by way of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which there are laws built in where we have to make sure there aren't districts drawn that are intentionally and inherently undermining of the capacity of minority populations to seek and gain representation. And so it's not identity-based, it's not ethnic-based, but it is certainly based very much on a definition of minority. But it also doesn't circumvent electoral politics. You still have to win. You're not guaranteed. And that really opens up I think you described it very well. So I guess what my question then is identity, and I call it identity-based federalism, really a misleading label for it, at least in terms of how it's evolved and come to at this point. And in some ways that if we were able to get rid of that, I don't know if that's possible, but the foreigners fearing Yugoslavia is going to dissipate, in part because it's a language question and people immediately jump to certain assumptions, and where there are very good models already existing, for example, in the United States. That's the first question. The second question is, when you mentioned the secession issue, the way you framed it was you said that the marginalized want to be part of the Nepali state. And what that immediately reminded me of is the country of Colombia, where 50 years of conflict of various kinds, and an absent state quite often, a repressive state apparatus, and there's all kinds of reasons why the citizens of Colombia would be very hostile and towards the state. The reality is, they constantly want, what they really want is the state to follow through, right? If any time there's an opportunity, there's a journalist, Juanita Leon, who wrote a book called Country of Bullets, and there's some extraordinary stories about different towns and things that happen, but the paramilitaries come through and the people kind of live with that, and the guerrilla comes through and they kind of live with that, but when the state finally shows up, this sense of relief is just palpable. And this is the same state that has let them down, that's oppressed them and so on, but they want a functioning state. And so I'm sort of, getting to my question then is, flesh that out a little bit. I'd like to know a little bit more, because it's very interesting to me, given how exclusionary and oppressive this state has been, how centralized it's been, why is there a desire to be part of that state? And so those are my...
Right. Thank you. Chris, by the way, actually knows Nepal quite well. Also, he used to direct an NGO called Educate the Children. That did some really good work in Nepal.
First is the Maoist leadership is dominated by Hill Brahmins. If you look at the standing committee, it's a 16-member standing committee. Let's look at the headquarters. The headquarters is 7 members, out of which Prashant, Baburam Bhattrai, you have the Kiran, who is the second senior vice chairperson. Three are clear. 3 are bounds. You have Badal, general secretary, Narayan Kaji Shresh Nevar, 5, and two others. One is again a bounce at 3, and one is a Gajuril. So that's so he's bound. So 4 bound. So and one this side, and post Bogati actually. So that's 5 this side, 2 this, 5 and 2. So the leadership, as I said, is primarily bound. But as you go down the party structure, you will see greater representation from other communities. So in the Constituent Assembly, for example, I don't have the exact numbers with me, but they do have a fairly large Janjati and Madhesi contingent, and even a strong Dalit contingent. So they have not accommodated these people in leadership positions, and even in standing committee, Politburo level. I mean, Politburo also has Politburo is a 45-member strong body, and even there you have only 2 or 3 Madhesis. In the standing committee, you have no Madhesis. So it's at the top exclusionary. As you go down, spreads out. That's the Maoist party structure, which is why they are accused of just using marginalized communities as foot soldiers and not really being committed to the agenda of their liberation. The second question about secession, it's a good question. When we were talking about secession in this context, I was saying that federalism will not lead to secession. The context that you are talking about is what if the aspirations are suppressed. If the aspirations are suppressed, then it's a different ballgame. Then you don't know what the demands of these groups will be. I mean, Bangladesh was not just a case of geographic aberration and Awami not being given power after by Yahya Khan and Bhutto in 1970. It was also a case of Bangla speakers having been systematically suppressed and deprived of linguistic rights. And so that had been building up for decades before the 1970 trigger happened. Now here, as I said, the Nepali state has been, despite all its conspiracies, has been in the past 5 years, because of this dramatic transformation that has happened, they have had to be accommodative of certain aspirations, which is why the Madhesi movement has led to great political representation of the Madhesis. There are 200 Madhesis in the House of 601, which is a major achievement. A major ministry is right now controlled by Madhesis. It has not translated into inclusion in the bureaucracy, into inclusion in the army, but it has translated into representation in politics. And I think if that continues, I think that should be the trend with other communities as well. But if they try to reverse that achievement, if they don't give federalism, if they hope to go back to the hegemony of families, I mean, that's not going to work, and that will of course radicalize politics. I mean, and this goes back to what I was telling him, that if you go back on federalism, it will radicalize politics, and then those issues and those demands may spring up. The third question, the unifying force. This is an intriguing question because the king's claim and the palace's claim was that he is the unifying symbol, and without him Nepal would disintegrate. This is a question that many people seem to ask now that we are all talking about our ethnic identities. What makes us Nepali? And in this angst-ridden tone, and I find it very, infuriating at times, because why do we need to have one symbol? My symbol will be the constitution. As long as I pay my taxes, as long as I follow the rule of law, and as long as I don't need to have a certain, I don't need to be a certain way to be Nepali, and I can have multiple identities. This is a question that there was a discussion on BBC Nepali Service last year, where they asked this question to a Madhesi politician and somebody else: are you a Madhesi first or a Nepali first? And then the politician said, I am a Nepali Madhesi. And this other Madhesi said that he's a Nepali. But I find that question very problematic. This is the question that the Hindu right wing asked the Muslims of India: are you Muslims first or Indians first? And and that's why I don't see the need for this one unifying force or to prioritize identity. It is a common political system, a common constitutional system which provides for inclusion is my unifying symbol. I don't need a king and I don't need a religion to be Nepali. The fourth question, and this links up to something that you said, but I'll come back. Your fourth question is about India and China meddling. Of course, it's an obvious thing. There is nothing called complete sovereignty. In Nepal's case, Nepal has been a partly sovereign country forever. India has played a role in each political transformation, given historic links, economic structural dependence. We share an open border. From fuel to salt, we depend on India for everything. For major commodities, India has deep penetration among all political actors in Nepal and among all state institutions. And India is almost a domestic actor. And this is not something that one is happy with, but this is the reality. And sorry. I think there is resentment about the overwhelming Indian rule, but there is among the political parties it is more than it's resentment when India does not take their side. So it's basically India is seen instrumentally. As long as India is backing them, it's constructive support. When India is not backing them, it's interference. So it's the parties have got pretty much used to Indian meddling and India having a role there. On China's engagement has grown. It has and it has also, I think, begun infiltrating and penetrating political parties and state institutions. But its core concern remains Tibet. They have shown some inclination in the past year, but to engage in even politics. But I don't think they have the same inclination or the leverage to shape Nepali political outcomes as India does. So they are not a substitute for India in terms of meddling, and they nowhere match up to India's role vis-a-vis domestic politics. Your questions about identity-based federalism, find me a better term. I stick to identity-based federalism because ethnic federalism is such a misnomer, and it's been used by the anti-federal Walas to not have to go against this and to discount identity completely. But if there is a better term, I'd be happy to go with it. My point is that it will be multi-identity federalism in a way. Perhaps that is that is perhaps something that one can use, multi-identity based federalism, because each province will have different identities. The question is who's dominant. I am not particularly equipped or qualified, as many anthropologists are, to debate the fluidity or rigidity of identity. I know this has a lot of literature and this has a lot of debate, but I do think that certain identities have been the basis for discrimination, and because they have been the basis for discrimination, these communities don't have time for such academic debates and would like to assert on the basis of the identity in which they have been on the basis of which they have been discriminated. But yeah, as I said, these will be multiple identity based, and I actually think, and Naveenji would know this better, but my sense, as you said, I think it is a turning point, and it's not been adequately recognized by Kathmandu commentators, that the principle of Agra Adhikar, preferential rights, has not been given. On local resources, for example, these communities will still assert and claim preferential rights. But I think there is a recognition among the leadership of the Janjati communities that you cannot get preferential political rights. In terms of the first model, the 14 state model committee had said that only a person from the dominant ethnic community will get to become the chief minister of that province for 2 terms. That is not heard in the debates now, and that will not be acceptable. And I think Janjatis, if they have been smart enough to give up that agenda, because that could not have been supported by many other groups, and in this broader coalition that is now emerging for identity-based federalism. And it is, as you said, a turning point. And then it will depend on electoral politics primarily, on why they want to be a part of the state. And this is something that I've often said in the past 5 years. I belong to a Madhesi background, and I've been writing on Madhesi issues for a long time. And when people ask me to describe what the Madhesi movement is, I always said that it's basically that I wear a kurta. My mother tongue is Maithili. I speak better Hindi than I speak Nepali. I have 10 relatives in Patna and only a few in Kathmandu, and I'm as much a Nepali citizen as you are. And that's what I think that's what it means. And I want to be as much a part of the Nepali state structure as anybody who speaks the Nepali language, who follows the Hindu religion, who wears the Daura Salwar, for example. So I think that's the crux of the debate. And yeah, I mean, it's a testament to, I think, the fact that the Janjati and Madhesi communities are willing to give this state a chance, and this state and the elite should recognize this. Given the history of discrimination, this is surprising. I mean, I would not be surprised I'm surprised that there aren't more secessionist movements. Actually, people are willing to give this a chance, and yet they're not being allowed to be a part of this, and that's the tragedy, real tragedy.
Analyzed federalism in 25 different countries of the world, and how relevant would it be in the case of Nepal? So actually, I support federalism. What I would like to ask is, we already had some people talk about it. There are people having multiple identities. People having, like in the case of Pakistan, why did Pakistan break up? Because they did not, the Bengali identity was not respected. That's why only religious identity did not work. However, in the case of Nepal is a country of minorities, but not religious. In other words, religiously 80% of people are Hindus. So Hindus are not a minority in Nepal. And of course, without, it was made secular. About marginalized communities, one question I would like to ask. Among Madhesis also, there are Savarna Madhesis, Brahman, Bhumihar, Kayastha, and there are OBCs and Dalits. Isn't there more marginalization among the OBCs and Dalits in Madhesi, among Madhesi? My one question is this. Like in UP and Bihar, the higher caste were ruling, but later on, now we have Nitish Kumar in Bihar and Mulayam in UP. The OBCs have become empowered. And about marginalized people, you seem to take all the high caste people as not marginalized. This is also wrong, because the most backward part of the country is mid-western hills and far western hills. There, Isimod has made a study, and we have 75 districts, and at the bottom of the list were the hill, Midwest and far western hills, where Brahmins and Kshatris made more than half of the population. There are no Janjatis living in that part. So your definition of you need to change your definition of marginalized. So there have been many so-called high caste people who are also marginalized. And another thing I want to ask is about the present alliance between Maoists and Madhesis. In UP and Bihar, which have very close ties with Madhesis, there has never been a communist government. Only among the bordering states, only in West Bengal there was a communist government, and that was voted out. Even that was not a Maoist government in West Bengal. It was similar to our UML. So, I mean, how do you explain the alliance between Maoists on one hand and Madhesis on the other? And my another question is, India acted as a broker in 12 Point, hoping that the Maoists, when they come into the mainstream, it will be an example for Indian Maoists to come to the mainstream, which has not happened so far. You have in that book that you showed, there is an article by S.D. Muni. He was in favor of that, which did not happen.
Sir, just one last. And other people want to ask also. I know you have many. Everybody has many questions. Just can you now stop? I'll come back to you later on. Okay. I think you have asked a number of good questions. So let's give it a Arjun and then
Okay, I have a question for Prashant, but before that I want to make a comment to Chris from Educate the Child, because I know Chris, we haven't met, but we have exchanged emails, and I'm one of the donors of Educate the Child program, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing in Nepal. But I think your argument, about the viability of identity-based politics and comparing it with the United States, and really arguing whether identity is a constant thing today or not. I think it doesn't matter, right? In the end, it's the people of Nepal, the marginal groups. They are looking for an assurance after 200 and so years of, extreme marginalization. What kind of system will assure them that they will have the rights? And down the road, like 40, 50, India is a perfect example. It's working there until now. So down the road, let's say in 100 years, we realize, yes, what you're saying, it makes sense. Then it will be still the people of Nepal who will decide to go that route. So it's not for anyone from outside or donor to say, this is not viable for you. It's the people of Nepal that will decide, right? Just a comment on that, because I felt that completely. So now a question for you, Prashant, is you talked about the conspiracies, hatched by many political groups, parties and such. But I want to know your view about the role of media in Nepal. When we think of Nepal, media, right? We think of like neutral role, impartial role, and any school of journalism will teach you that, right? And Nepal actually enjoys a great deal of freedom of press. But yet, as a reader of many Nepali online outlets, when I look at them, I find it very, very partial, very, very biased. Why is that? These people, many of them, they went to the same schools like people that write on New York Times and such. But I don't see the kind of analysis that you presented today from those so-called quote-unquote mainstream media. So what kind of role they're playing and why they are so biased, and what's your view on that? I'd like to know that. Thank you.
Lady Daniel, it was wonderful. Thank you for all of this material. It was amazing. I hope you will forgive me for my minimal understanding about the complexities of this major revolution that just happened in a tiny little country. I worked with Nepali artists for a long time, and Gurung artists perform tamang dances, and tamang dancers perform Sherpa songs and dances, and identity is kind of pluralistic. So I suppose the question is, forgive my baby question here, is when you use the term federalism to mean what? A governing body to represent all, quote, regional groups, meaning what? Regional meaning Gurung here, Tamang there, Madhesi here, and these divisions that are evolving and transforming because of all of this major revolution is the only word I can think of. I never like thinking about the United States in relationship to Nepal, but when we think of the United States now, in terms of who represents what, the richest guy wins in elections. So where's the representation, right? Native Americans, some are still pulling away and having land by themselves with their own currency and this and that, but not most of them. The question is, what does federalism mean in the context of this very textured and wonderful talk that you get? Federalism meaning a governing body, one governing body with representation from all these different groups, that it's not specific whether they live here or there, or they all live together, or they're all mixed, or whatever. That's the part that they're working out now, right? Like who gets what, representation based on regional. Regional means area, but ethnic, I don't even use the word ethnic when we perform. I use the term regional to mean you're young. So regional is different now than what regional used to be, right? I hope
I think we got this.
Yeah.
I think let's take whatever questions we have, one or two more, and then I think this is the last one. Okay.
Yes, Prashant asked me, wanted me to confirm something. He said that the demand for preferential rights has been dropped.
Political.
I don't have that information. I have difficulty to believe that. I don't think that is correct. Maybe it has not been put on the table now because the other issues are there before. But also very quickly on this terminology, in Nepal actually we are using the word ethnic federalism based on ethnic identity. It's not identity-based federalism. And again, if there are people who are worried about it, that is their problem. The aspiration of people of Nepal is that they want to have a federalism based on ethnic identity. And there are lots of debates about it, but again, like what Arjun was saying, if you think about the aspiration of people, that's what they are aspiring, and I think that the system has to respond.
So Mandeep.
Bureaucracy, the civil service, how is it presently adapting, and how do you think it's going to deal with federalism, which is unavoidable and it will be tasked with implementing? And will it be supportive or will it be reactive?
Question one is, I'll begin with Vasudev. The first question was about multiple identities. I mean, I completely agree with that, and that's the point that I've also been trying to make, that emphasizing one identity at a particular point or in history to make certain demands does not mean undermining another identity. And Nepali, the term we can be Nepali as well as belong to an ethnic group, and the demand for federalism comes from this and does not seek to undermine the national as many people feel. So on that I think we're on the same page. On the differentiation within Madhes, of course, Madhesi Brahmins, Kayas, Rajputs and Bhumihars are the highest, one of the relatively the highest human development index, and that is perhaps the reason that I am here, that I belong. I recognize my privilege, and I recognize the fact that I was lucky enough to be born into a caste which enabled me to get this education and these opportunities. And I think it's important that hill caste Brahmins and Kshatris also recognize that they have been born into privilege, a sizable section of them, and I'll come to your next question about that. And it is time to share that, and it is time to by pointing out that there is deprivation among Madhesi OBCs and Madhesi Yadavs or Madhesi Dalits. I don't, this is, and I'm not saying you are doing this, but this is sometimes, in my view, a mischievous argument used by people who are against federalism to undermine the movement or undermine the demand for federalism. For 30 years, for 50 years, nobody talked about Madhesi Dalits. Nobody talked about Madhesi OBCs. The people who are now talking about, but what about them? They are poor. Of course, they're poor, and this is a long struggle. I mean, class-based, the class fault line is fundamental in Nepal, along with the ethnic fault line, and the two often overlap. And these are challenges which have to be dealt with. And as I argued, I think federalism gives us a better way and a better chance to deal with even class-based problems than this centralized structure run by a very few families, if I may say so. On your point about the poor bound Kshatris, I agree with that also. I mean, as I said, there are multiple fault lines in Nepal. There is a class fault line, there is an ethnic fault line, there is a regional fault line, there is a gender fault line, there is a caste fault line, and all sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't. But the Bawan Kshetri, what we are discussing right now is federalism in the context of marginalization in a different context. Now, if you look at the poor Bawan Kshetri in Far West, he or she, they suffer from class-based discrimination, but they do not necessarily suffer from an identity crisis. The Madhesi has an additional problem about identity crisis. And the fact that his or her identity has not been recognized, and he's been treated as a dhoti or an Indian throughout. And here he's seeking to be Nepali. So there are additional liabilities and burdens some communities have and others don't. This is not to say that there is no class problem or there is no poverty among dominant communities. When I say dominant communities, I essentially mean the dominant of the dominant communities who have monopolized the power structure all along. The Maoist Madhes Alliance, I think it's a very interesting question, and I think it's a very interesting question because it leads us to a larger debate about the Maoist party in Nepal and how it's different from, and how it has positioned itself so differently from Indian communist parties. And and I think the success of the Maoist party till now has been based on the fact that they have recognized the identity-based discrimination issue. The problem with communists in India, I think, and again, so you will correct me if I'm wrong, is that they don't understand North India and caste. And they have not been able to mobilize and deal with identity politics in these states. And the Maoists in Nepal were clever enough to understand how deep the deprivation went and how emotive this issue was. And on the Maoist Madhesi Alliance, I think there are major contradictions in this alliance. The Madhes movement, as you know, had a topic, I can go on about it. On the role of the media, I think this is a problem that I also struggle with, and I get very angry when I read the Kathmandu papers every morning. But I'm trying to think of why this has happened, and I think the reason why it's happening is that the society right now is so polarized, and polity is so polarized that you cannot have the media living in a vacuum and not reflecting the tendencies of the social tendencies and political tendencies. The bias that you're talking about is so pronounced is because most proprietors, most editors, most news desk chiefs, most sub-editors, most reporters belong to a certain community and belong to certain communities, and their preferences appear on the pages, right? You can see a disconnect even in newsrooms between people belonging to different communities. So, I mean, that polarization is so deep that that's reflected there. And the other problem is that, as I said, it's dominated by certain communities, and the problem of inclusion in the media. If I think we address those issues, perhaps the media thing would become more nuanced. And I don't think my presentation was not biased. This was a very biased presentation. I have a clear bias, and I don't hide it. Other people who you are, I think, referring to have another bias, and they would like to stop this change, and they are public in that bias. So, I mean, that's a battle that one fights. Identity, I didn't really get your question, but I think, when we are talking about federalism right now, we are talking about carving out provinces, deciding territorial boundaries, deciding division of powers between centers and states, in a way where political power will go down and will not be concentrated in Kathmandu, will go down to these provinces, and these provinces will be run by the communities who live there and by individuals who live there. So it's not only the Gurungs who will run Tamua, there are other communities there, and they will have to be given a share of political power. And I agree with your point about the interplay between different ethnicities. I mean, that interplay has happened, and this is today a farm. I think there are major differences, but there is also an interplay that has happened, and that's a good thing. I mean, I must clarify what I said. What I meant was that in principle, Madhesi parties, for example, have not given the one Madhes Pradesh demand. In private negotiations, what they are telling the other parties, okay, let's talk about two. I think in principle, Janjatis will not give up Rajnitik Agradhikar. And you would again be better informed about this, but in private negotiations at this juncture, this is not the issue that's being debated. And I think this is a helpful stance to take, because as soon as this agenda is pushed right now, even getting any kind of federalism or federalism that takes into account identity will then be, this will be used as an excuse to even take that aside. So for now that agenda has been left, and once there is a constitutional design, without that I don't see how they will be able to insert it, and it will have to depend on electoral politics. And I think that's the wiser thing to do. The role of the bureaucracy, Sumandai, my sense is that the bureaucracy will not be cooperative because again of who dominates the bureaucracy. I think the bureaucracy has more or less reconciled itself to the fact that there will be a federal structure, and one hears now of at least some degree of planning and meetings that's happening at the top level of the bureaucracy. But it's going to be a struggle. I mean, as you know, if there are federal structures, 70% of bureaucrats based in Kathmandu will have to go to districts and the states. And these people have spent all their lives and all their energy in getting to Kathmandu. They have just about got there and paid money to get there, bribed politicians, and they have got there, just bought property, send their kids to schools in Kathmandu, and they'll be told go to whichever district. So there will be resistance. There will be resistance both because of these reasons, but also because of this larger. It's not. I hear Madhesi ministers, many of them are friends, and they tell me that they find it very difficult to work with the bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy is completely from a different community, and the bureaucracy would be more responsive in other cases. And there are right now many reports of Madhesi ministers being crooks. They're not the first ones who have been crooks. There have been there was no bigger crook than Girija Prasad Koirala in terms of making money. But some people get away with it because the bureaucracy plays along, and some people get exposed because the bureaucracy sees an interest in exposing them. And I think that also can be traced partially to the immaturity of the Madhesi politicians in not sharing the loot, but also because of the different ethnic communities that they belong to. So the bureaucracy will not be an ally.
Sharing the loot, that's the key, right? That's what federalism is all about.
Yeah, that's what federalism.
The other way to look at it is federalism is about sharing the loot. Well, anyway, thank you very much, Prashant. Thank you all.